The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which is a detail that probably doesn't matter to anyone but me. I know it was Tuesday because I had just come back from my 7 a.m. run, the one I do every Tuesday and Thursday along the waterfront trail before the city gets loud, and I was standing at my mailbox in my damp jacket when I saw the envelope with the university seal in the corner. I had been waiting 11 months for that letter. I set it on the kitchen counter and made coffee first. I don't entirely know why. Maybe I needed the ritual of something ordinary before I let the extraordinary in. Maybe I was afraid it was a rejection. Probably I was afraid it wasn't. The letter was not a rejection. It was an offer of admission to the Master of Public Health program at Johns Hopkins, with a partial scholarship covering 60% of tuition and an invitation to join Dr. Ewan's research cohort studying environmental health disparities in post-industrial communities. I had applied 18 months earlier, deferred my application once, rewritten my personal statement 3 times, and driven 6 hours to Baltimore for an in-person interview that I paid for on a credit card I was still paying off. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen with my coffee going cold beside me, and I cried for about 4 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called my mom. She answered on the 3rd ring. I could hear the television in the background, the particular cadence of whatever morning show she kept on while she made breakfast. I got in. I said, "Hopkins, with scholarship money?" "Oh, honey," she said, "that's wonderful." And then, without a pause that could have held anything, she said, "Your brother's opening his restaurant this weekend. Did you see his Instagram?" I had not seen his Instagram. I told her I hadn't. "He's been working so hard," she said. "You two should really reconnect. You know how much he looks up to you." I stayed on the phone for another 90 seconds. I said yes in a few places. I said that sounds great in one place. Then I said I had to get ready for work, and I hung up and sat there on my kitchen floor for another few minutes looking at the acceptance letter on the counter. That was the moment I finally admitted something I had been rearranging furniture in my mind to avoid for most of my adult life. Not that my family didn't love me. I think they did and do in the ambient, unfocused way that some people love the people they're supposed to love. But love without attention is just a word you use to describe a habit. And I had spent 29 years being the habit nobody examined. Let me back up. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the older of 2 kids. My brother is 4 years younger than me, and his name is the kind of name people remember, the kind that sounds good, said out loud in a room. He was the kind of kid who could walk into a party and walk out with 3 new best friends and a standing invitation to something. I was the kind of kid who read the dictionary for fun and organized my closet by color and got straight A's in a house where straight A's were acknowledged, the way good weather is acknowledged. Fine, expected, not remarkable. My brother got a C in 10th grade biology, and my parents sat with him at the kitchen table for 2 weekends in a row, patient and present, helping him rebuild his understanding of cell division. I got a 4.0 that same semester, and the main thing I remember is my mom saying, "Well, we knew you would," at dinner, and then asking my brother if he wanted more pasta. I am not telling this to make them villains. I spent a long time wanting to make them villains, because villains are a clean story. The truth is messier and less satisfying. They were 2 ordinary people who found one of their children easier to worry about than the other. And they worried accordingly. I was the one who didn't need worrying about. That's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't have a clean name. I left for college at 18 on a full academic scholarship to Ohio State. I came home for holidays and the occasional weekend, and I watched my brother's gravitational pull on my parents increase every year. Not because he was doing better, but because he was always doing something that required their active involvement. A business idea that needed their input. A breakup that needed my mom's attention. A cross-country move they had to help him plan and then partially fund. By 25, I was living in Pittsburgh, working as an environmental compliance analyst for a mid-size consulting firm, running trail half marathons on weekends, building a life that was genuinely mine and quietly proud of it. By 27, I had started the application process for graduate school, knowing that a research credential would let me do the kind of work I actually wanted to do, the kind that looked at why certain zip codes have higher rates of childhood asthma, why certain water systems fail before the people living near them are told about it. Hopkins was the program. It had been the program since I was 23 and first read Dr. Ewan's paper on legacy contamination in former steel corridor communities. I knew what getting in would mean professionally. I also knew, on some level I was not fully honest with myself about yet, that I had wanted someone in my family to understand what getting in would mean. The orientation weekend was in late August. Baltimore in August is not subtle about itself. The campus was beautiful in the way that very old institutions are beautiful, slightly worn, deeply serious, sure of what it is. I checked into the graduate student housing and spent the first night arranging my desk and telling myself I was fine being there alone. I was fine. That is true. But fine and okay are not the same word. The orientation itself was 2 days of welcome sessions and research introductions, and a dinner on Friday evening in a courtyard with string lights and catered food from a Lebanese place on Charles Street. I met a woman at my table named Faye who was starting the same cohort after 8 years working in county health administration in rural Tennessee. She had warm hands and a very dry sense of humor, and when she found out I had driven from Pittsburgh, she said, "So you're either very committed or you don't trust airlines." I said, "A little of both." We ate our food and talked about our research interests, and she told me about her daughter who was 7 and had asked very seriously that morning whether Baltimore had the same moon as Tennessee. At some point during dessert, she asked me if my family was nearby. "They're in Ohio," I said. "Did they come to help you move in?" I shook my head. "There was a thing this weekend. My brother's opening his restaurant." She looked at me for a moment. Just a moment. Then she said, "Well, their loss." And she picked up her fork and changed the subject queenly, without ceremony, and that small mercy was one of the kindest things anyone did for me that weekend. I started the program. The work was demanding in the way I'd needed work to be demanding. The kind that pulls your full attention into it and leaves you tired in a way that feels like something. Doctor here. UN ran the cohort with a combination of high expectations and genuine investment in each person's specific question, which is rarer in academic settings than it should be. My particular research focus was air quality monitoring gaps in communities located within 2 miles of retired industrial sites. Specifically, the lag time between when environmental data showed elevated particulate levels and when public health advisories were actually issued. I worked. I ran. I called home every few weeks and had conversations that skipped across the surface of things like a stone on water, my brother's restaurant. I heard about it constantly in those first months. It was called something with an ampersand, the kind of name that looks good on a logo. My parents had gone to the opening. My dad had given what I gathered was a sizable loan to help with the build-out. My mom had helped design the menu layout. I'd not been invited to the opening. This is not a small detail that I am inflating. I checked my email and my texts in the days before it happened and there was nothing. No casual "Hey, are you around this weekend?" Nothing. My brother and I had not spoken in 4 months at that point, which was not unusual. We were not close in the way that some siblings are close. We were close in the way that people who share parents are sometimes assumed to be close, which is a different thing. I did not bring this up. I filed it alongside the other things I had been filing for years, in that internal drawer that you keep telling yourself you'll sort through someday. Someday arrived about 8 months into my first year, in the form of an email from a woman named Dr. Castillo at the Regional Air Quality Monitoring Consortium, a nonprofit that worked directly with state environmental agencies across the Mid-Atlantic and Rust Belt. She had read a conference paper I had co-authored with Dr. Ewan on monitoring infrastructure gaps, and she wanted to know if I would be interested in a 2-year fellowship position, fully funded, beginning that September. The fellowship would involve embedded work with 3 state environmental agencies, helping them identify and address the specific reporting delays my research had quantified. It was the most directly useful thing I could imagine doing with what I had learned. It was also based in Cleveland, which was 2 hours from Columbus. I will be honest with you about what I felt when I read that email because the triumphant version of the story would leave this part out. I felt the pull of proximity. 2 hours from home. Maybe, I thought. The way you think things you know are probably not true. Maybe this would be the thing that made the situation with my family quietly better. Maybe being closer would make us more real to each other. I accepted the fellowship. I gave notice at my graduate housing. I drove the 7 hours from Baltimore to Cleveland on a Saturday in late August with my car packed to the roof and a podcast about the history of urban planning keeping me company. I texted my mom when I crossed into Ohio. She sent back a heart emoji and a note that my brother had hired a new sous chef and things were really looking up at the restaurant. I unpacked my apartment in Cleveland over 2 days. Nobody came to help. I bought a second-hand bookshelf from a woman on Facebook Marketplace who helped me carry it up 2 flights of stairs without being asked and refused to take the extra $20 I offered her. I thanked her 3 times and she said, "You've got good energy. This apartment's going to be fine." I believed her. The fellowship work was immediate and absorbing. The consortium had identified a pattern in air quality reporting across 4 counties in northeastern Ohio, former steel and rubber manufacturing areas, where the official monitoring stations were positioned in ways that consistently underrepresented particulate exposure in the residential neighborhoods closest to the legacy industrial sites. The gap wasn't random. There was a structural reason for it, related to where the original stations had been placed in the 1980s, when different populations lived in those areas, and nobody had formally updated the siting criteria since. My job, in the most condensed version, was to help state environmental staff understand what their own data was telling them and build the policy case for remediation. I found myself going to community meetings in church basements and school cafeterias, listening to parents talk about their kids' asthma rates, sitting with data that I knew was incomplete in ways that were directly affecting people's health. It was the hardest and most clarifying work I had ever done. 3 months into the fellowship, I was reviewing a set of voluntary emissions disclosures from regional manufacturers when I came across a filing from a company called Hardwell Hospitality Group, which had recently converted a former industrial property in the Tremont neighborhood of Cleveland into what their permit application described as a mixed-use dining and events venue. The property was in one of the monitoring gap areas my team had flagged. Hartwell Hospitality Group was my brother's company. He had incorporated it 14 months earlier. The restaurant with the ampersand in its name was one of 2 venues he was now operating. I sat with my laptop open for a long time. The issue was not that he had done something illegal. The issue was that his permit application had listed no prior industrial use history for the property, which was inaccurate. The property had operated as a small-scale metal finishing facility until 2009. Metal finishing operations can leave behind chromium and lead contamination in soil and in building materials. The permit application, as filed, had not triggered the environmental review that would have been required if the prior industrial use had been properly disclosed. This is not a dramatic discovery, this is a paperwork gap. But paperwork gaps in environmental permitting exist because the consequences of a full review feel expensive and inconvenient, and the consequences of not doing a full review are borne by people who eat in the restaurant and work in the building and live in the neighborhood. I disclosed the conflict to my supervisor at the consortium, a deliberate and careful man named Dr. Osei, within 24 hours of finding the filing. I typed out the full situation, my relationship to the business owner when I had discovered it, what the specific issue was. He read it the same afternoon and said, "You're recused from any policy recommendations touching that property. The documentation review, you continue. And thank you for telling me the same day." That night I called my brother. We had not spoken in 6 months. He answered after 5 rings, sounding slightly distracted, restaurant background noise behind him. I told him what I had found. I kept my voice even and factual. I explained the prior industrial use history. I explained what that should have triggered in the permitting process. I told him the consortium's report to the state environmental agency would include the property's documentation gap and that he should talk to an attorney before that happened, and that the most straightforward path forward was a voluntary disclosure and a soil and materials assessment. There was a long silence. Then he said, "You found this on purpose." "I found it doing my job," I said. "You've had it out for me since the restaurant opened," he said. "You didn't even come to the opening." I wasn't invited, I said. That is a fact. Another silence. Do Mom and Dad know you're doing this? This isn't something I'm doing to anyone, I said. This is a documentation issue that needs to be corrected. People work and eat in that building. He hung up. I contacted an attorney who specialized in environmental whistleblower protections. I documented everything, my disclosure to Dr. Tu. Oh, say, the timeline of when I found the filing, every communication with my brother. I kept copies of all of it in 2 separate places. My brother called my parents before I did. I know this because my mom called me the next morning before I had finished my coffee. She was not angry in the way that involves raised voices. She was angry in the quiet, injured way that is harder to answer. She said she didn't understand why I would do this to the family. She said my brother had worked so hard to build something. She said the restaurant was finally starting to make money. She said my dad was one of the investors, and did I understand what this could mean for them? I let her finish. Then I said, there may be soil contamination in a building where people spend hours every day. I found a documentation gap that needs to be corrected. I told my brother before I told anyone else. I gave him the chance to handle it proactively. That's still the best option available to him. Margot, she said, and then stopped. My name is not Margot. She said my name, my actual name, and then stopped. And what followed the stop was something I can only describe as the sound of her not knowing what to say for the first time in a long time. I said, I'm not doing this to hurt anyone, but I can't unfind what I found. She said, I just don't understand why everything with you has to be so complicated. I thought about that for most of the afternoon. I think what she meant was that I had, again, failed to be simple. I had, again, prioritized something outside the family's immediate comfort over the family's immediate comfort. I had, again, been the one whose choices required reckoning with. The consortium's report went to the State Environmental Agency 6 weeks later. My name was not on the sections touching the Hartwell property per my recusal. Dr. Osei's name was on those sections. The documentation gap was noted. The agency opened a review. The review found what it found. Elevated chromium levels and 2 soil samples from the crawl space beneath the main dining room. Not catastrophic, but real. A remediation order was issued. My brother's business partner, who I had never met, apparently had stronger nerves than my brother did, because from what I eventually gathered, it was the partner who engaged an environmental remediation firm quickly and professionally and got ahead of the worst of it. The restaurant stayed open during remediation. The work happened in the crawl space and in a section of the prep kitchen. They posted the remediation notice in the window as required. I drove past it once on a Saturday morning, not to see it specifically, just because it was on a street I sometimes ran near. The notice was there, small and official, taped to the inside of the glass. I kept running. My parents did not speak to me for 2 months. My brother did not speak to me at all. I want to be accurate about what that period was like, because the easy version would be that I was at peace with it. I was not at peace with it. I was lonely in a specific way. The way you are lonely when the people who are supposed to be your origin story decide you are the antagonist in theirs. Faye, from orientation, called me on a random Wednesday evening during that period. We had stayed in loose touch, the occasional text, a phone call every few months. She asked how I was doing, and I told her, more honestly than I had told anyone, that I was not entirely sure. She said, for what it's worth, what you did sounds exactly like who you are. I asked her what she meant. She said, you're someone who finishes things correctly. That's not always comfortable for the people around you, but it's who you are. I thought about that too. My mom reached out first, which surprised me. It was a text, not a call. She said she wanted to talk. We got on the phone that Sunday, and it was not an apology, not exactly, but it was something closer to honesty than I'd heard from her in years. She said she thought she and my dad had gotten so used to worrying about my brother that they had stopped noticing they weren't worrying about me. She said she thought they had confused me being capable with me being fine. She said, "You came back to Ohio and we still didn't really show up for you, did we?" It was not a question. I think she knew it wasn't. I said, "I think we have a lot of conversations to have that we'd been skipping for a long time." She said she thought so too. We are having those conversations now, slowly and imperfectly. My dad called me a month after my mom did. He said, "Less." He is a man who processes things over a longer timeline, and I have made a decision to let that be true without resenting it. He asked about my work and I told him about it in more detail than I had ever told him about any job, and he listened in a way that felt new, or maybe just newly visible. My brother and I have not spoken. I left that door cracked by sending him a brief, plain message 6 months after everything concluded. I said I hoped the remediation had gone smoothly. I said I was open to talking when he was. He did not respond. I am trying to hold that with open hands. Here is what the fellowship year taught me, outside of everything related to my family. There are places in this country where children grow up breathing air that official data says is fine, because the instruments measuring it were placed by people who were not thinking about those children. The gap between what is being measured and what is actually happening is not always malicious. Sometimes it is just inertia, the accumulated weight of decisions made by people who are no longer around to question them. Closing that gap is slow work. It requires being willing to say, out loud and on the record, that the data does not match the reality, even when saying so is inconvenient for people you are connected to. Especially then. I am still in Cleveland. I extended my fellowship for a second year. I have a good apartment now, the one with the second-hand bookshelf. I adopted a dog in February, a 3-year-old hound mix named after a hiking trail in West Virginia, and she requires more brushing than I anticipated and is the best decision I have made in several years. Last spring, Dr. Toole, Ewan invited me to co-present our monitoring gap research at a public health conference in Chicago. I sat on a panel with 3 other researchers and a county health commissioner from Pennsylvania, and we talked for 90 minutes about the policy infrastructure that allows these gaps to persist. There was a woman in the audience who raised her hand during Q&A and said she lived 2 blocks from one of the sites in our dataset and had been telling her city council for 4 years that something was wrong with the air in her neighborhood. I looked at her and I said, "You were right. The data backs you up, and here is what that means for what your city is required to do next." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they have been waiting a long time to be told something true. I thought about all the waiting that goes into that kind of nod. My mom texted me a photo last month unprompted. It was an old one from my college graduation, the one neither of them came to because my dad had a work conflict and my mom didn't want to make the drive alone. In the photo, I am 22, in my cap and gown, squinting into the sun with a woman I no longer remember standing beside me. She texted, "I found this cleaning out some boxes. I'm sorry we weren't there." 7 words. No explanation. No context offered. I looked at the photo for a long time. 22-year-old me squinting into the sun, not knowing yet what the next 7 years would ask of her. I texted back, "I know. Thank you for saying so," and I meant both parts of that equally. Here is what I want to leave you with, because I've been thinking about how to say this in a way that's honest rather than tidy. There is a version of the story where the point is that I was right and they were wrong, and the outcome proved it. I understand why that version is satisfying. I understand why some of you would have handled it differently than I did, would have cut contact sooner, would have never made the call to my brother at all, would have let the process happen without warning anyone. I don't think you'd be wrong. But here is what I kept coming back to, in the 2 months of silence, in the late nights when I was certain I had permanently destroyed whatever remained of my family for the sake of a soil sample in a crawl space. I did not want to be the kind of person who knew something and stayed quiet about it because the knowing was inconvenient, not in my work, not with my family. Those 2 things turned out to be the same principle, applied in the same year to situations I had not predicted would overlap. I don't think I'm extraordinary for that. I think I'm just someone who finally stopped rearranging the furniture. The dog is asleep at the end of my couch right now. It's early on a Sunday. The light in Cleveland in October comes in low and gold through my windows, and the street outside is quiet in that specific way that cities are quiet before they remember themselves. I make my coffee. I read. I think about the woman in Chicago who was right about her air for 4 years before anyone told her the data agreed. I think this is the work. The long, unglamorous, document everything work of making the gap smaller between what we measure and what is actually true. If you are the capable one in your family, the one they stopped worrying about because you never gave them a reason to, I want to ask you something. When did capable start to mean invisible? And who decided that was a trade you agreed to make? I'll let you sit with that. I've thought a lot about what my mom said that Sunday on the phone, that she and my dad had confused me being capable with me being fine. I've turned that sentence over in my mind, the way you turn over a rock to see what's underneath it. And I think she was right. But I also think the confusion didn't start with them. It started earlier in me, in the decision I made somewhere around age 12 or 13 to stop asking for things I didn't think I'd receive. That decision protected me. It also made me invisible in my own family for almost 2 decades, and I participated in that invisibility by never naming it out loud. There is a kind of intelligence that knows how to endure quietly. I had that kind. I used it to get through school, through jobs that asked more than they gave, through holidays that felt like performances of closeness rather than the real thing. But intelligence without honesty is just a sophisticated way of avoiding the truth. And the truth I had been avoiding was that I had built a life that looked complete from the outside, while something essential inside it had been running on a very low flame for a very long time. What changed wasn't the fellowship. It wasn't finding my brother's company in the dataset as significant as that moment was. What changed was Faye asking me, over catered Lebanese food and a Baltimore courtyard, whether my family had come to help me move in. A simple question. The kind that has no weight at all if the answer is easy. The answer wasn't easy, and I heard that finally in my own voice when I gave it. What I did after that, accepting the fellowship, moving to Cleveland, disclosing the conflict, calling my brother, none of it felt brave in the moment. It felt like the only available sequence of actions for a person who had decided, quietly and without ceremony, to stop participating in her own erasure. Courage isn't usually dramatic. In my experience, it looks a lot like paperwork and difficult phone calls and documenting everything in 2 separate places just in case. My brother made choices. The permit application was incomplete because disclosing the prior industrial use would have triggered a more expensive review process. That is a choice. The consequence of that choice was not something I engineered. It was something that already existed in the data before I ever opened that file. I was the person who found it. I could have closed the tab. I didn't because people were eating in that building and working in it and living near it, and that matters more than family comfort. It matters more than my family's comfort, and it matters more than my own. That is not a judgment I reached easily, but I reached it. What I know now, that I didn't know at 22 standing in a cap and gown next to a woman I can't remember, is that the people who benefit most from your silence will rarely be the ones who ask you to break it. You have to decide that on your own. And you have to be willing to live with what comes after. The quiet months, the careful texts, the conversations that arrive years late and still mean something even then. Dr. Osei thanked me for telling him the same day. Faye said I was someone who finishes things correctly. The woman in Chicago nodded slowly when I told her the data backed her up after 4 years of no one believing her. Those are the moments I return to. Not because they validate me, but because they remind me what the work is actually for. If you have spent years being the capable one, the low-maintenance one, the one nobody thinks to check on, I am not going to tell you that the people who overlooked you will eventually come around. Some will, some won't. What I will tell you is that the life you build on the other side of finally being honest about what you need is steadier than anything you build on the old foundation of being fine. The dog is still asleep at the end of the couch. The coffee is still good. The light is still coming in low and gold. That's enough. Today, it's genuinely enough.